The dictionary definition of a covenant is a contract between two parties. In religious terms, there are two types of covenant: the greater covenant and the lesser covenant. But there's another covenant that pertains to God alone, that God created His children, and He promises He's not going to leave His children alone, but send teachers from time to time to educate them. This is called the everlasting or eternal covenant, and it pertains to God alone. The greater covenant is the covenant made by the manifestations of God regarding the coming of the next manifestation. It is this covenant that Moses is fulfillment of the covenant of the greater covenant made by Abraham. Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of a greater covenant made by Moses. Muhammad is the fulfillment of a greater covenant made by Abraham, by Jesus Christ. And the Bab is the fulfillment of a greater covenant made by previous manifestations regarding the coming of the herald in the end times. And Baha'u'llah is the fulfillment of a greater covenant made by all manifestations of God in the past regarding the coming of the universal manifestation in the end times, that He will unite all mankind. A lesser covenant is a covenant made by the manifestations of God regarding His successor. It is this covenant which is the subject matter of our commemoration tonight. This is the covenant that Baha'u'llah appointed Abdu'l-Baha to be his successor. A lesser covenant was also brought by previous manifestations. As you all know the story of Moses when he brought the children of Israel from under the rule of the Pharaoh of Egypt and took them to the promised land, which was known in the olden days as Canaan. But before Moses and the children of Israel reached Canaan, Moses died. But before Moses died, he appointed Joshua to be his successor. So that is the lesser covenant in the Jewish faith. And Joshua was able to take the children of Israel, and they reached the promised land, Canaan, and established a kingdom there. With their first king was called King Saul, and then King Solomon and King David. This happened about 1,000 years before Christ. There is a story of Muhammad when he returned from his pilgrimage to Mecca, and he was rested on a vast plain and ordered his followers to stack up horse saddles to make an improvised pulpit. And on the top of this pulpit, he raised the hand of Ali and virtually said, "After me, follow Ali." And that is the lesser covenant in the Islamic faith. But both of these covenants were not binding. So what happened to an unbinding covenant? Divisions arose straight after the passing of the manifestations, as we can see with the Islamic faith. When Muhammad died, the followers did not like the idea of having Ali to be the successor of the Prophet. So instead they elected Abu Bakr to be the first caliph of the Sunni denomination. From then on, that division between the Sunni and the Shia, and that division still exists today. This covenant cannot be compared to the covenant of Baha'u'llah, that he wrote it himself in the form of a book called the Book of the Covenant, or the Kitabiyat, and sealed it with his own stamp of seal of approval. So this is a covenant, is a firm and solid foundation for the faith. So we all know in the line of succession in the Baha'i teachings that after Baha'u'llah it was Abdu'l-Baha, and after Abdu'l-Baha is Shoghi Effendi, and after Shoghi Effendi the Universal House of Justice. That is true to a certain extent. After Baha'u'llah, it was Abdu'l-Baha that he appointed. But after Abdu'l-Baha, it was not only Shoghi Effendi. In Abdu'l-Baha's will and testament, he appointed twin successor. And you all know twin means two, not one, two. One of Abdu'l-Baha's successor was able to implement his duty because he did exist at the time, and that is Shoghi Effendi, the guardian. The other successor of Abdu'l-Baha did not come into being because there were conditions laid down in the provisions of the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha that were not met. And one of these conditions is to spread the teachings of faith to all corners of the earth, establishing local spiritual assemblies, in their turn elected national spiritual assemblies, who are the pillars of the other successor of Abdu'l-Baha, the Universal House of Justice. Shoghi Effendi spent his entire ministry setting goals and set up teaching plans and sent believers all over the world to spread the teachings of faith and fulfill these conditions laid down in the provisions of the will and testaments of Abdu'l-Baha. And he succeeded tremendously. At the time of the ascension of Baha'u'llah, the faith was in 2 countries. At the time of the ascension of Abdu'l-Baha, it was in 35 countries. But by the time of the sudden passing of Shoghi Effendi in 1957, the midpoint of the 10-year crusade that he inaugurated in 1953, the faith had reached 254 countries and territories. It was an incredible and marvelous achievement, unmatched by anyone. If you consider world organizations like the United Nations has 199 member countries. The Olympic Games that was held in Melbourne, Australia, is recorded as the most countries attended that Olympic Games. It was attended by 198 countries. Nowhere near the 254 countries and territories achieved by Shoghi Effendi. So by the time of the end of the 10-year crusade that Shoghi Effendi inaugurated in 1953 and completed in 1963, we were able to hold our first Baha'i International Convention and elected the other successor of Abdu'l-Baha, the Universal House of Justice, with the presence of 56 national spiritual assemblies. In one of the early letters in 1947, letters from Shoghi Effendi to the American believers, he mentioned the mental test that will face believers in the future. And that future is now. He mentioned some of these mental tests. They are apathy and lethargy and obedience to the covenant. He told them in this letter that the friends must be fully deepened in the covenant of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha. He said it is the stronghold of faith. It is a stronghold of faith for every Baha'is. It will make them to withstand any attacks by the enemies outside of faith, and the far more dangerous, insidious and lukewarm people inside the faith, who has no real attachment to the covenant, and consequently uphold the intellectual aspects of the teachings, while in the same time undermining the spiritual foundations upon which spiritual foundation of the faith upon which the whole cause of God is rest. The whole cause of God rest. Undermining spiritual foundations. Spiritual foundations are the institutions of the administrative order. That is the assemblies. Undermining the local spiritual assemblies, the national spiritual assemblies, universal houses of justice. It is not enough for us to only read the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha and Kitab-i-Ad, or the Book of the Covenant of Baha'u'llah. We must study it. We must deepen in it. We must fully acquainted with its content, and we should pray for confirmation. These subjects really saddened the spirit of Abdu'l-Baha all his life, even right to the time of his ascension. There was a Baha'i magazine in America called Reality. It was the organ of the Baha'i communities of America. And it suddenly appears in its columns an article advertising the activities of the covenant breakers. It really disturbed and saddened deepened believers, old believers and firm believers. But the undeepened and lukewarm believers were unperturbed. It was this attitude that prompted Abdu'l-Baha to reveal tablets 6 months before his ascension that was published in the Star of the West, which he reminded them that Baha'u'llah had warned that there would be a foul odor that will spread after him, and that foul odor is covenant breaking. 2 weeks before his ascension, Abdu'l-Baha wrote to his reliable correspondent in America named Roy Wilhelm, asking Roy how is the health of the friends. And Roy cabled back immediately and said, the activities of the covenant breakers are agitating. And he even named some of these people. And Abdu'l-Baha immediately cabled back with a strongly worded warning. He said, he who sits with a leper will catch leprosy. In our writings, covenant breaker is considered as a spiritual disease compared to a physical disease called leprosy. He who sits with a leper will catch leprosy. He who sits with Christ will shun the Pharisees and abhor Judas Iscariot, certainly shun the violators. There are 3 words in our writings that describe covenant breakers. One, of course, is covenant breakers. The other is violator. And the other is Nakeseen, Nakeseen. In other places, it's spelled Nakezeen. If you come across these 3 words in Baha'i writings, then you know it meant the same thing. Shoghi Effendi said of those believers that are infected or affected by this disease of covenant breaker as unwary believers. Unwary means not cautious. If you are friend in Facebook with these people or their associates, to me, you are not cautious. If you read their writings in whatever form, to me, you are not cautious. If you have conversations with them, to me, you are not cautious. All these exhortations and advice is for our betterment, for our protection. They have no power over this faith, but they can persuade or influence individuals. There is a statement in our writings about the power of the covenant, and I'm going to paraphrase it in here. It says there is a power in this cause far, far, far away from the ken of men and angels. It will dash into 1,000 pieces all oppositions. If I break something into 1,000 pieces, it will become dust, and dust float, and a wind of despair will blow it away to total oblivion. In other words, the power of the covenant will totally annihilate it and obliterate all oppositions. So any opposition or would-be oppositions to this covenant, be warned. There are 11 Baha'i holy days in a year. 9 of these holy days are work suspended and 2 are not. And these 2 are the Day of the Covenant, which we are commemorating now, and the ascensions of Abdu'l-Baha in two days' time. The not being a work suspended day, holy days, does not diminish the importance of these days. We must treat it as important and as equal to the work suspended, to the other work suspended holy days. Have a wonderful commemoration of the Day of the Covenant, and good evening.